vomiting, rashes, diarrhea, temper tantrums, or just being a little bit tired. What can all of these have in common? Well, the answer is food. Today I'm going to be talking all about food intolerances, sensitivities, and also a bit about food allergies. I have a lot of patients who come to me with these questions, and certainly I get a lot through Instagram too. So feel free to DM me or type anything below during this live and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So, okay, let's demystify a few things first. The difference between a food allergy and food intolerances or sensitivities is pretty marked. So a food allergy is your typical very rapid reaction to a food that your child is allergic to. So that means the body actually mounts an immune response. And most typically what we talk about is something called an IgE immune response. Don't worry, I'm not going to get too technical, but bear with me because this kind of helps me explain the difference between a food allergy and a sensitivity. So an IgE response is, as I said, really quick. Your child only needs a small amount of the food to set them off and they can get quite an aggressive reaction to it. These are things like hives, that itchy rash that I've posted about quite a lot recently, so head back to my feed if you missed those. But it's that raised red itchy rash. They can also get swelling around their face, lips, eyes, even in their throat. And this leads us to the much more dangerous consequences of a food allergy. So swelling of the throat, not being able to breathe. You know, your child may become a wheezy, struggling to take breaths, any kind of noisy breathing. They can also get abdominal pain, severe vomiting. And then they can even progress into anaphylaxis. What's anaphylaxis? Essentially, it's a more diffuse, severe allergic reaction, including blood pressure going down. This is really, really serious. And these are children who go down the path of investigations with skin prick testing and then determining whether or not they need to have an adrenaline pen, also known as an EpiPen. So food allergies, they are very obvious and can be life-threatening. And it's very, very important for all of these to be properly managed by an allergist, immunologist, or a pediatrician. Okay, so I wanted to mention that first, just so that you've got a picture of, you know, the life-threatening, urgent condition of food allergies. And P.S., 1 in 10 children in Australia have a food allergy. Totally frightening. You know, which is why all our schools are now nut-free. When I grew up, and yes, I'm soon approaching the big 5-0 in a few years, but you know, when I was at school, we were easily able to take like peanut butter sandwiches to school. I think there was one child, you know, that I can remember in our high school that had a food allergy. But, you know, they are on the rise, and I guess that's the topic for a whole other live that I'm very happy to delve into. But we do know that food allergies are incredibly common. I've mentioned nuts. While I'm on the topic, I might just quickly mention a couple of the most common food allergies, just so that you're aware of them. And why, as a parent, is it important? Well, it's important for 2 reasons. One, just to have that knowledge in terms of what other children can be allergic to if you're having parties and things like that. And also, I think perhaps even more importantly, is these foods are important for your child to be exposed to soon after they start solids. So the rule of thumb is by a year old, children should be exposed to all the highly allergenic foods. So highly allergenic just means much more likely to cause a food allergy, and I'll just quickly tell you what they are now, in no particular order. Dairy and soy, wheat, eggs, all types of nuts, seafood, and sesame seeds. So that's the group that we just have to make sure our children get exposed to when they're young. Okay, so moving on from food allergies, we go on to the topic of food intolerances and sensitivities. I'm kind of separating them, even though the words are often interchanged with each other. So just bear with me a little bit and I'll explain to you why. So if you remember a food allergy, All you need is a little bit, and you can have a significant reaction, and it's a rapid reaction. So in other words, eat the food, soon thereafter the reaction. The difference with intolerances and sensitivities is often it is volume based. So the more that the child eats, the more likely they are to have an adverse reaction. And also it can be delayed, and this is where it becomes really tricky to diagnose, and I'll go into diagnosis in a little bit. So how delayed? How long is a piece of string? It can be many hours, it can be many days, you know, and this is why keeping a very, very clear, long food diary, so at least I usually say 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how often, I guess it just depends on the child and how often having symptoms or any kind of reaction. You know, so it's being vigilant, and sometimes you have to reflect back a day or two, you know, in terms of trying to work it out. But a very important part of the puzzle is keeping that food symptom diary. The next point to make is that I've already said volume, right? So I guess the most common thing that most people will see is, or that I will see is, and maybe, you know, you guys can also have, maybe you guys have also experienced this, but if you have, for example, a whole lot of dairy, and let's use milk as an example, because it's a pretty common one. You know, if you have a whole lot of dairy, it may make your poo a little bit runny, it may make you a bit bloated, you know, where if you have a small amount of dairy, you don't have any of those symptoms. So that's quite classic in terms of volume. When we talk about the difference between intolerances and sensitivities, again, I'm not that fussed by the naming of it. I think it's just the importance of knowing the difference between the acute serious allergy and the more delayed other symptoms. Often though it's talked about intolerances being more specific about, let's say, a chemical in the food. And I'm not talking a man-made chemical, I'm just talking natural substances that are in the foods themselves. And this can certainly happen. Or it could be, you know, and again I'll use milk, because most people have heard of a lactose intolerance. And what that is lactose is the sugar that's in the milk. And when you've got a lactose intolerance, it means you can't properly digest that sugar. It doesn't mean you're going to have a full allergic reaction. It just means your gut isn't going to absorb that milk properly and then cause side effects. The most common being diarrhea and bloating and smelly bites. So that would be a quite classic example of a food intolerance. Another one actually is MSG. I'm just thinking of that now as I'm talking. MSG, both naturally occurring as well as added. I went out for a very rare girls' dinner the other night to a wonderful restaurant, and I woke up the next day with the worst headache, and no, it wasn't because I'd overindulged in wine. It is because the food had actually contained MSG, and foolishly I hadn't asked. You know, so it's just about being a little bit aware of that. The group of food sensitivities, again, can be a little bit more vague, so it may not be something that you can even test for or pinpoint to a specific food that easily. What symptoms am I talking about? It is things that, if you remember right to the beginning, I was talking about things like being a bit cranky, being a bit tired, maybe some like brain fog. You know, obviously children aren't perhaps as eloquent at expressing that. You know, but you can notice little things in your kids. More common things that I will see are gut disturbances, or not sleeping properly, being tired. You know, it really can be anything. Which then brings me to the point of not everything is from food, but a lot can be. And it is always important to consider how a child's diet is impacting on their health and general well-being and behavior. And again, I'm going to go back to that food symptom diary. So I guess more practically speaking, what do you as a parent do if you think your child has any of the conditions I've been speaking about? So the food allergy one is pretty straightforward. You need to see your doctor, and we need to do tests, and potentially you'll go home with an EpiPen. correct teaching, etc., and wonderful support that we have here. The other group, it becomes a little bit more murky, and it becomes a bit more murky because diagnosis is tricky. Some of you may have heard of blood tests you can do for food sensitivities. I don't recommend those, and the reason being that if you look at the literature and the science, there isn't actually a lot of evidence behind them. If you remember, and this is why I said it's going to become a little bit clearer, when I'm speaking about food allergies, you know, the significant anaphylaxis ones, we talk about that immune response using IgE. Food sensitivities, those tests you do, test for IgG. So just to demystify all this, really IgE, acute allergic reaction. IgG really means that your body has been exposed to something before and recognizes it. I guess the other example would be if you've had an infection in the past and you've still got the antibodies sitting in your body. It doesn't mean you've got the infection, it means you've had it in the past. And so a lot of these food sensitivity tests look for IgG. The immunologists and allergists, when they've looked at the science, don't believe that that IgG actually reflects any clinical symptoms. All it reflects is that your child has been exposed to those foods in the past, which in my mind is not very helpful. And typically, I'll have a lot of patients who've had the test done before they come and see me, or perhaps the parent has had the test done, and typically what will happen is that the foods that come up that it's coming up that they're sensitive to are actually foods that are quite common in their diet. And I guess you can have two reactions from that. You can either go, well, oh well, that explains why I'm not feeling, you know, like I'm ready to run an ultra marathon today. But it could also mean, oh well, that just means I've been eating a lot of it. So my message is, you know, take those tests with a pinch of salt, and I don't usually recommend them for my patients. What do I do? After that food diary that I've spoken about multiple times, so you're not surprised there, I do actually consider controlled elimination periods. What do I mean by that? The gold standard really to determine a food sensitivity is to take the food out, see how the child is doing, note if the symptoms that you're concerned about have resolved, and then reintroduce the food and see what happens and see if those symptoms come back. The reason I say controlled, if you remember I said a controlled elimination diet, is that children are fragile, vulnerable, growing individuals. So what we need to do is make sure we are taking out foods safely. And that means safely in terms of their nutrition and their caloric intake. So what we don't want is to suddenly take out a whole lot of foods and then they don't get all the building blocks that they need. So I really recommend, if you are considering elimination diets, to do this with a professional. You then take it out for a period of time. It's not a forever thing. And then you reintroduce. And then you make the decision about the long term. And depending on the symptoms, etc., and the foods, at that point, you know, a dietitian may be involved, or supplements, etc., etc. The other question I get asked a lot is this going to go away? And that's for all of them: allergies, intolerances, sensitivities. And although I hate to say this phrase, it depends. It depends on what the food is, how old your child is, and how severe the symptoms are. The good news is a lot of these are outgrown. So the majority, I would actually say, are outgrown. But it is a child-by-child basis. And especially for the food allergies, and I'm not going to go into all the details now about immunotherapy and you know, the science behind that, and also what the research now at the moment, which is, I'm sure you can understand, I find fascinating, about using probiotics plus immunotherapy together, which I guess leads me into you know, the food sensitivities. You know, I guess I'm trying to think of another example food. We'll go back to cow's milk because I've kind of used that all through. If you know, I will find sometimes, for example, children will become constipated if they have a lot of cow's milk, and so we'll decrease the cow's milk, or the eczema will flare up if they have a lot of cow's milk, so we'll decrease it. But or, you know, after a period of elimination. But I guess the question is, well, what do we do during that period while while we're keeping it low in their diet or out of their diet completely? And what I like to do is try and make sure that there's no other inflammation in the body, that we are nurturing the gut, the microbiome, because we know that the microbiome is central to our child's immune system and regulating that correctly. And you know, the theory is that there could be gut inflammation, leaky gut, which is predisposing children to these sensitivities. So in practical senses, what we want to do is try and make sure that your child's gut is as healthy as possible and as robust as possible, so that when we do reintroduce those foods, they're less likely to react in a negative way. So that's kind of my whole blurb on food allergies, intolerances, sensitivities. I am happy to answer any questions if you have any to ask. Alternatively, I do have a resource. It's a little bit more aimed at babies with cow's milk protein, but there's some interesting information there about the difference between food allergies and sensitivities, and that is on my in my bio. You can just see the link there, and it's called "Could Your Child Have Cow's Milk Allergy or Intolerance?" So I hope that you have found that helpful and interesting. And as always, please DM me with any other suggestions or requests for topics for me to talk about. And I will see you again next week. Thank you for joining me and for watching this today. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.